Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Stephanie Cox in for Tiffany Meyer. Our top story, China is facing a new 15% tariff on all goods exported to the United States. That's on top of the industrial tariffs Trump imposed last year. And President Trump says China will benefit if the Supreme Court rules against his birthright citizenship order. The court is set to consider the issue in April. Fake news sites tied to the Chinese Communist Party. A new report says a China-linked network is impersonating major U.S. media outlets. It's targeting a New York performing arts company founded by victims of communist persecution. An event in Nashville depicting the challenges Christian communities are facing worldwide and how believers are responding.
China's at war with God. They will not win this war, but they could cause a lot of death and carnage in the process.
President Trump is imposing a new 15% tariff on Chinese goods. It's part of a new global tariff on all U.S. imports announced after the Supreme Court struck down the president's reciprocal tariffs. So, how will this impact China? Here's a closer look.
During his second term, President Trump has placed a range of tariffs on China. Some of them were struck down by the Supreme Court last week when it invalidated Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to collect tariff revenue. Under IEEPA, Trump had placed a 10% tariff on Chinese goods for China's role in America's fentanyl crisis, plus a 10% reciprocal tariff. This did not apply to products from certain targeted industries like electric vehicles and solar panels. IEEPA was not used to set tariffs for those products. Section 301 was used instead, and the rates were usually much higher. SCOTUS then struck down IEEPA, abolishing Trump's 10% reciprocal tariff and 10% fentanyl tariff. That means the tariff rate on Chinese goods was reduced by 20%, except those industry-specific products like electric vehicles. Those tariffs were left unchanged because they were not implemented under IEEPA. In response to the Supreme Court's ruling, Trump then introduced a global tariff which now applies to all Chinese goods, including those industry-specific goods. So that means tariffs on Section 301 and Section 232 products are now 15% higher than they were pre-ruling. But tariffs on all other products have been reduced by a net 5%. So, for example, if today you want to import a Chinese electric vehicle into America, you'll pay 15% on top of what you would have paid pre-ruling. But if you want to import an agricultural product that hasn't been tariffed under Section 301, you'll actually pay 5% less than you would have before the SCOTUS ruling. It's still not clear if the revenue collected under IEEPA will have to be refunded. The president was asked about it.
They take months and months to write an opinion, and they don't even discuss that point. We've taken in hundreds of billions of dollars, not millions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so I said, well, what happens to all the money that we took in? It wasn't discussed. It's not discussed. We'll end up being in court for the next 5 years.
President Trump is set to visit China at the end of March and beginning of April for talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. On Sunday, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer said America's negotiating position will not be weakened by the Supreme Court ruling and that existing agreements with trading partners will remain in place. Currently, the average U.S. tariff on Chinese goods stands at around 40%.
President Trump is warning that any change the Supreme Court might make to his birthright citizenship rule could help China. The court is set to consider the case in April. Trump argues that the 14th Amendment wasn't meant to benefit the children of non-citizens who happen to be in the U.S. when they're born. Instead, he says it was written to grant citizenship to formerly enslaved people at the end of the Civil War. Trump suggested that if the court were to reinterpret his birthright citizenship rule, it could end up benefiting foreign adversaries like China. The president says he's worried the court might reach what he called the wrong conclusion, one, he says, would make foreign nations happy and rich. Some online news sources may not be what they seem. A recent report reveals that fake websites are impersonating major American news outlets to spread pro-Beijing messages. The campaign is targeting New York-based performing arts company Shenyun, highlighting Beijing's ongoing efforts to silence the group. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
A recent investigation is exposing a coordinated Chinese influence operation. Researchers at Graphica identify 43 domains and 37 subdomains, all hosted in China, impersonating outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Guardian, among others. They're calling it spamiflage, a propaganda campaign that relies on fake accounts and coordinated dissemination. A main target is Shenyun Performing Arts, a New York-based company that showcases traditional Chinese culture and portrays China before communism. Shenyun also depicts the Chinese regime's human rights abuses and suppression of religion. The company was founded in the United States by practitioners of Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, a spiritual discipline based on meditation and moral teachings, and that's been severely persecuted by the Chinese regime since 1999.
My first MC partner was from Beijing, and the National Security Bureau would visit her family in Beijing every single weekend, telling them, "We know what your daughter is doing, get her to stop it." We had an erhu player, this is a musician soloist. When she was performing with us, her husband was jailed for 3 years and tortured.
Researchers say that many of these spoofed websites attacking Shenyun were created over the past 5 years. The investigation also uncovers contracts between Chinese government organizations and public relations firms that promote this content. In one example, the city of Changchun paid a Chinese PR firm more than $15,000 to publish hundreds of promotional reports and videos in what were described as international media networks. According to the report, 41 X accounts and 3 Facebook pages amplified the articles in a coordinated manner, using randomly generated usernames, stock profile photos, and almost no followers. They posted identical content at the same time, criticizing Falun Gong and Shenyun. And most of the domains appear to target Chinese audiences, but several are designed for English-speaking readers overseas. The concern is that the campaign exploits both mainstream media branding and Western social media platforms, giving fabricated stories an air of credibility and extending Beijing's pressure campaign beyond China's borders. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Faith leaders, media executives, entrepreneurs, and humanitarian groups from around the world gathered this week in Nashville for the National Religious Broadcasters Media Convention. This year's event featured discussions on the global challenges facing faith communities and the ways believers are responding. NTD's Chris Bobb has that story.
The convention brought together faith leaders, organizations, and innovators from across the world. One group, Equipping the Persecuted, works on the ground in Nigeria to help Christians targeted by violence.
Nigeria accounts for 90% of all Christian persecution deaths worldwide in the last 5 years. Boots on the ground mission that responds to these attacks within 48 hours with food, aid, and medicine. We help pay for the wounded. We support over 1,000 widows per month. And we work with orphans, and we help educate the uneducated kids that are forced into these IDP camps.
Former U.S. Ambassador Sam Brownback stressed the importance of standing with religious communities worldwide.
It's true. China's at war with God. They will not win this war, but they could cause a lot of death and carnage in the process. I mean, most of us have been grown up under communist China, which is atheistic, but the actual culture itself is undergirded by a deep set of spiritual beliefs. Like, you want to awaken that and bring that up, which is exactly what the Chinese Communist Party, that's officially atheistic, wants completely shredded.
In Ukraine, faith communities are on the front line of conflict, with hundreds of churches destroyed in the ongoing war.
There are 2,300 Baptist churches that belong to our union in Ukraine, and yes, we are the largest, not only in Ukraine, the largest evangelical community, but the largest evangelical community in Europe. 320 of these are at the occupied territories of Crimea and the east regions of Ukraine. 110 churches stopped to exist because, like, towns and villages completely destroyed. It is clear for us that there is coalition of evil which includes, from our perspective, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. But this is a problem. As soon as you, as a country, withdraw your presence from the world affairs, the same minute China, Russia, and other authoritarian regime would step in.
To watch the full interviews and NTD's extended coverage of NRB, visit ntd.com.
Reporting from Nashville, Tennessee, Chris Bobb, NTD News.
The U.S. is welcoming India into a new tech and AI alliance called Pax Silica. The group aims to prepare for the AI era and counter China's dominance in critical technology supply chains. On Friday, India became the 10th nation to join the alliance, which also includes Japan, South Korea, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates. Officials say the alliance will focus on tech access, AI regulation, and reducing dependence on any single country for critical minerals. U.S. and Indian representatives highlighted rising global demand for cutting-edge computer chips, memory, and other key components for artificial intelligence. They pledged to take a pro-business approach to AI regulation while promoting innovation for developing economies. The move also comes as U.S.-India relations are warming after last year's trade disputes. India had faced high tariffs under the Trump administration, which are now being reduced. And recent U.S. policy changes have made India a key destination for tech investment. Google and Microsoft have announced multi-billion-dollar projects there to expand cloud, AI, and data infrastructure. Analysts say India's decision is driven by a desire to diversify supply chains and avoid dependence on China. A senior U.S. official called India the only country on Earth that really provides a real alternative in terms of the depth of its human capital and the scale of its market to China. Coming up, 15% global tariffs. President Trump isn't backing down. What impact have his tariffs had on America, and what's next? An expert breaks it down. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Stephanie Cox in for Tiffany Meyer. President Trump has announced a new 15% global tariff. It comes after the Supreme Court ruled to strike down the use of tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. To discuss, NTD's Don Moss spoke to Christian Briggs, economist and CEO of Hard Asset Management.
And as you know, the president called the ruling ridiculous. He said during that press briefing, he said he can destroy trade, basically, but he can't charge a little fee. Can you just talk to us about this? What are you thinking about this ruling?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and it's a great topic. So the constitutionality of what President Trump was trying to use in this terms of being imposing the tariffs was something a little more outside the conventional box, let's say that. But it wasn't without good reason. So what President Trump did was he utilized the value of I call it the emergency context. It's the context of that it's kind of a catastrophic event. You know, people are talking about the debt and the deficit and trying to be able to make fair trade a lot more palatable for the trading partners that we have and for the United States. In other words, he wanted a level playing field. The bottom line is he went through all of these hoops to be able to create a level playing field. The Supreme Court was probably not out of the box when I look at things like the ACA back in the day, the Affordable Care Act. You know, people said, oh, you can't do that because of the interstate commerce law about taxation across the state lines. And Roberts said, no, we could do it. And then the Supreme Court came back and looked at this and said, you know what, we're not going to give it to the president because the constitutionality is going to come into more of a play here. In other words, it's going to be first and front row, the reasoning behind our decision. Even though I believe that many of the justices thought what President Trump was doing was the right thing for the country, but now he's going to kind of circumvent it again. I think he's going to come out with a whole new plan.
Okay, so, I mean, at the end of the day, Christian, do you think this ruling is good for the economy, bad for the economy, somewhere in between? Is there going to be much change after this?
Well, it's going to be good for the country that we maintain constitutionality within the way the Supreme Court looks at every piece of legislation or an executive order, because an executive order is legislation until the Supreme Court either yays or nays it. So it is good for the country from a constitutional standpoint. It puts everybody back in check. Now, but the bad part is the tariffs do have some strong fundamental value in order to be able to maintain the consistency of trade negotiations. That's the key. As in the past, sometimes the Supreme Court will rule and give the president favor because the genie is already out of the box. And again, I bring up the ACA, that part of the reasoning why Roberts was the final decision maker on that was the genie was already out of the box regarding the amount of people that were on health care. So this ruling is good for constitutionality. It's good that President Trump now has some type of understanding, the borders, if you will, about where he can play within and kind of what the Supreme Court is telling him, you can't go past this. I think what we're going to do is we're going to have a new set of versions of how he thinks the tariffs can stay in place. And the economy needs these tariffs in a sense because it makes our domestic manufactured goods more appealing, less expensive, and it encourages international manufacturers to come to America to avoid the tariffs and bring that manufacturing back within the United States.
Okay, so on that note, maybe you can elaborate a bit more on the impact that these tariffs have had on the U.S. up to this point, to the ruling.
Okay, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that one because a lot of people kind of miss the value of the pros and cons on the tariff. So good question. Let's talk about that. The pros are that we have actually increased already the presence of domestic manufacturing from international trading partners. This is a fact. Whether it's automotive, whether it's making just small little widgets, whatever it is, that's already increased. Jobs are starting to come back to America, both from internal manufacturing as well as international manufacturing that's either expanding here or coming here altogether. So the good parts of the tariffs are as follows: increasing competitiveness within domestic manufacturing. Import prices are still high, so it makes domestic products more attractive. It encourages the economy to be able to look to manufacturing as the next wave of GDP growth. Now, the downside of tariffs, and there are some downsides, but it's not the kind of downside that people look for long term. The internal amount of tariffs that are being charged to the American people is about $150 billion right now that people have paid in additional costs for those goods. Now, those things range from different things, but knowing that that imported parts or imported items have about $150 billion now in additional costs that the American people did pay. The question is how does that $150 billion impact the economy or impact the bottom half of America? Because that is the amount of money that these people, because if you're making quite a bit of money, those tariffs don't have quite the disadvantage effect on incomes or people's discretionary income as it does the bottom half of America. However, I've said this before, whatever we may pay a little bit more in tariffs on the bottom half can be offset dramatically by wage increasing. And how do we get wage increasing? Manufactured jobs. So what Trump's saying is, look, a little pain right now on the tariffs for long-term gain, and the gain is going to be significant, I believe, in the second half of this year. But 27, we could have that 4 and 5% GDP consistently because manufactured goods has the largest amount of impact in the economy, period.
So, Christian, I'm sure you're aware of this. On the day that this was announced, Friday morning, stock markets had a little bump up immediately following this news. Can you just talk to us as well about what investors are thinking?
Yeah, okay, let's talk about that. I did notice that as soon as the Supreme Court came out with its ruling and then gave the White House kind of the perimeters that it would need to be working within the context, the market took that as saying it wasn't a full-blown, you can't do tariffs, you just can't do tariffs in the way of which you're trying to do them. Now, I've said this before, when the market reacted like that, it was very positive, at least from a decent gain within the Dow and, of course, the NASDAQ, which means the investor community liked the way the Supreme Court came back to President Trump. Even though President Trump wasn't really pleased or happy with the way the ruling was, they did give him some latitude in some of the language that said, look, you can't do it this way. However, there might be some other ways in which you can do it. Unless, of course, you go right to the legislative body, which is Congress, and get the permission and get them to say, yes, we're going to vote for these tariffs because, in a sense, it's taxation. But the investor community were really happy the Supreme Court said what it did, giving President Trump, again, some latitude and possibly a little pivoting opportunity on Monday, which I believe that's what President Trump plans on doing.
Okay, just one final thing, Christian. And I was talking about this issue a couple days ago with some of my guests, and the question came up whether this diminishes President Trump, whether it's domestically or on the global stage. Because President Trump has said he ended wars with these tariffs. He used these tariffs as a negotiation tactic. And you alluded to, I think, earlier that now with this ruling, President Trump will have to jump through a bit more hoops. So, I mean, what do you think? Do you think this sort of diminishes him in terms of foreign policy, national security on the global stage? What do you think?
Okay, let's talk about that. Will President Trump, in the eyes of his beholders, okay, the world stage of international trade and, of course, international negotiations, diminish him? Not at all. Let me tell you why. See, one of the things that President Trump, the man, let's talk about Donald J. Trump, whenever he looked at real estate deals and there were challenges ahead of him, and some of the times I'm sure he tried to get his permits and work with all the unions to be able to get these big, beautiful buildings built, whether hotels or residential towers back in Manhattan. You see, a man like Donald Trump doesn't look at challenges as adversity roadblocks. What he does is he says, okay, that's just one way not to try to make that happen. It's like they always say, is how many times did Edison try to make the light bulb work? 1,000 times. None of those were defeats. They were just ways of which not to do it. So what I look at is President Trump, because of his success in real estate and success in business overall, he doesn't look at this as a roadblock. What he says is, okay, that's just one way we can't get it done, so let's look at another way to get it done. So the international community is not going to look at President Trump in any diminished light whatsoever. That would be a complete falsehood. They're going to look at him and say he's even stronger, because a man that can overcome challenges becomes stronger when he finds the direction he needs to go in order to be successful. They always say, don't invest in a person that's never had challenges or some defeats, because then when that happens, he won't know what to do. So Trump looked at this and said, hey, you know what? What we're looking at here now is one way not to make the light bulb work. Let's look at the ways we can make it work. And so that's what they're going to do come Monday. And I'm sure the White House counsels and all of his legal team and constitutional lawyers were looking this over the weekend and even prior to that. I can tell you right now, there's no way that they didn't have A and B ready to go. A, if he got the ruling, and B, if he didn't get the ruling. And he didn't get what he wanted. So you know what? They've got a plan. It's no different than being delayed on building a building. He'll work through it. He'll get it done. It does not diminish him. In fact, I would tell you this, he's probably stronger now than any time in the second term.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Stephanie Cox in for Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. And for round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.